Hey, welcome back. We are continuing with the English colonies. We didn't get a chance to finish Jamestown and Maryland in the Chesapeake region, so we're going to try to get that done today. We're also going to try to do not only Chesapeake, Jamestown, and Maryland. Okay, we're going to go through to New England and talk about the Mayflower. Talk about the Mayflower and the establishment of Plymouth, the Mayflower Compact, and how this was organized. We're going to get to Massachusetts Bay, John Winthrop, who is extremely important for Massachusetts Bay, the Great Migration. We're going to do a New England sprite on New England, which you're going to have to do as a way to organize this information. We're going to talk about the Protestant work ethic. We're going to talk about Harvard and Hutchinson and Rhode Island, as well as Roger Williams. These people are going to tell us about the culture of the northern colonies or the New England colonies, specifically intolerance. It's very interesting, very, very interesting. And then we'll go back south. We'll talk about the Carolinas, New York, New Jersey, Georgia, and Oglethorpe. Okay, so those are all essential elements, and let's see how much we get done today. So again, going back for political, when we think of, one of the reasons we care, you have to ask yourself, why do we care about Jamestown? What do we care? Why do we care about this colonial period? And I want to suggest to you that think of it this way. The metaphor is of time, okay? Here we are in 2020, and we have a president and we have this long 200 years of history, et cetera, right? So let's say George Washington is elected in 1789. We're 1609 is Jamestown. 1620 is Plymouth. 1630 is Massachusetts Bay, et cetera, et cetera. 1700, right? We have a decade. And so what the point is that I'm trying to get, part of why we study history, is that the seeds are planted here. And I use the concept of seeds because they're going to grow into the democracy we have here. These seeds are going to inform the writing of the Constitution, 1787. Okay? Is the Constitution. 1789, George Washington takes place, and the nation is established here. What happens in the colonial era and how these colonies develop are going to come back to us in American history. So, for example, the Civil War, 1861 to 65. The seeds of the Civil War are planted back here in the colonial era, and they're cultivated here in the Constitution. So again, there's connections to earlier eras. The Civil War has got connections back in the colonial era and in the Constitution and in the causes in the 1850s, etc. And so if you're thinking about American government and how we develop, the American government that starts here and lasts 200 years is influenced by what happens in the colonial period. Our culture influences the way we create the country, the government, and it creates our outlook on things. So these colonial roots or seeds mature in the period of our nation. And that's, again, just like George Washington's administration has an influence on all American government. The experience of the Civil War is going to have influence on the future of the American government. The experience of the Native Americans in African Americans, etc., are going to influence American government. And so that's kind of why we want to be informed about our past, to see why we believe what we believe, and preserve the good things and stop the bad things. And that's kind of one of the big messages with why we study the colonial era. So see if you can find these connections. Jamestown, so political, Sprite, again. We care about Jamestown politically because it is the seed of democracy in America. The first democratic institution in America is established in Jamestown. And again, you guys know what the term democracy is, right? Democracy is a government where citizens vote. All of the citizens, by the way, means, vote. The first democracy was ancient Athens. And remember, the citizens voted and they made collective decisions. If something is democratic, if it's democratic, this is an adjective that means people vote. Okay? If it is a republic, that's a form of government, right? That's a form of government where what? Citizens vote. What do they vote for? They vote for representatives who then make decisions. And the representatives represent the citizens. Okay? So when we say the United States is a republic, we have a House of Representatives, and then we have a Senate, right? Where citizens vote for representatives who go to the House and the Senate. And then they make the rules for the citizens, and that's called a republic. Okay? Now, is there voting? Yes. Is it technically a democracy where all citizens vote? No, but it is democratic, which means there's voting. I hope you understand that. So the first voting we have in America comes with Jamestown, and it's an English institution. Remember, in England, they have the Magna Carta. Hopefully this is useful to you. The Magna Carta broke the concept of autocracy of the king. Autocracy means one rule. Autocracy was broken by the Magna Carta that said the king must share power, or absolutism. Do you follow? The king must share power with the nobles, and they create a constitutional monarchy. Well, by 1600, there's more voting in England, and they bring that voting tradition to the Americas. And so the English bring democratic concepts to America, and they are replicated in each of the colonies. You'll see this. So the first big idea is that the crown of England, the king of England at that time is James, promised, quote, all rights of Englishmen to the settlers. Okay, and there is some voting in England, so there's going to be voting in America. 1619, the Virginia Company, remember, who is the representative of the king, created the first representative body in the Americas called the House of Burgesses. Everyone say House of Burgesses. And so a Burgess is a notable person, an upstanding person in this society. It's not a noble person. It's not. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. So, a notable person in society, and they will be representatives of the citizens of the colony. Okay, so do you follow? The House of Burgesses will be elected, and again, who can vote? You get white males with landowners could vote and hold office. Okay, so an example is a geographic location. If this is the colony, they divide the colony up into parts, especially as it grows, and says, okay, you own land, you get to vote. These are the landowners in this area, and they vote for one of their peers, and then they go to the House of Burgesses. You got to know the House of Burgesses. You got to know this quote, because what's going to happen is that when we get towards the Revolution, the colonists will say, they are taking my rights as an Englishman. Well, their rights as an Englishman was to vote. Okay? It gets complicated, but just know the first democratic institution was the House of Burgesses, where they said it's basically a self-government body. Okay? So that's very important. We'll come back to this later on also. So just know the House of Burgesses. And by the way, this is tobacco. This is tobacco farm in Cuba, which is very similar to the farming you saw in Jamestown. A thatch roof, whatever, that's different. But look at these, the giant tobacco leaves. These are, pretty big, plants. Here's the tobacco. Once it's being dried, the leaves are harvested and then they're hung carefully, and it's dried and it's cured, and then it is made into tobacco, like cigars, or it's shipped or whatever. By the way, here's a really good movie that I want you to pay attention to. This is called The New World. It's Colin Farrell, Christian Bale. Colin Farrell is the story of Jamestown. This is John Rolfe, and this is John Smith. Captain John Smith. And when he goes back to England, John Rolfe learns about tobacco from Pocahontas, marries Pocahontas, takes Pocahontas back to England, where she gets sick and dies. Later on, John Rolfe will be killed by Indians. So that's a great story. You should watch some of that. The story of John Smith and Pocahontas as having a love affair or any of that stuff, that's fantasy. But I think that what you want to look at in this movie would be examples of how the Indians are portrayed and how the early settlers are portrayed. Those are really good, accurate depictions. So watch some of that movie if you can. All right. The last colony, another colony that is established in the Chesapeake, is Maryland. 1632, so about 20 years, about 15 years, 16 years after Jamestown is established. This was Charles I. They divided part of Virginia and gave some of it to this guy named George Calvert, or Lord Baltimore. Baltimore is the city in Maryland, is one of the main cities. It is a proprietary colony. Now, this is different than a joint stock colony. Remember the joint stock colony we talked about the other day? The joint stock colony was a profit colony, but it was a company. Investors owned the colony, owned the land and any produce. Okay, Now with this one, this is a proprietary colony. And what this means, it's a single owner. And basically Lord Calvert or George Calvert or Lord Baltimore was the owner. Just think of it this way. If the government of England owes money to one of its noblemen, how would they pay for that if they didn't have the cash? So they say, well, we can give you the cash eventually, or we can give you a big chunk of land in the New World. So from the English Crown's point of view, it's a no-brainer. We're going to give them land. The land may or may not be profitable, and depending on how it is developed. And so if the king says, here's a whole bunch of land, forgive my debt, that's a win for the crown. It may be a win for George Calvert or other proprietors, but it's definitely a win for the king, because he gives this land and says, here, take this land. I don't owe you any money. And so that's what they do. They give, the proprietary colonies are owned by one person. George Calvert Maryland was entirely owned by George Calvert. And what he would do is he would sell and develop it and make money off of the colony to get his money back. Again, they're loyal to the crown, so the proprietor had the role to enforce the law. Lord Calvert, which makes it special, has a religious component, and this is Catholic, a refuge for Catholics. Now, this is very important. You have to understand the Reformation. You have to understand the anti-Protestant attitudes by the Catholics and the anti-Catholic attitudes by the Protestants. The problems in Europe are transplanted into the New World. So just the short answer is, Maryland was a place that Catholics could travel to and be tolerated for their difference of religion. Okay? Now, so what's significant about this is that this is going to be one of these elements of religion that later on will have separation of church and state. And this will be one of the reasons why. So Catholics were hated by Protestants. In England, we'll have a whole war, and they'll behead a king over the concept of religion. And so this is during the Catholic era in England. And so Catholics were being repressed over the Protestant Reformation. Remember Henry VIII, etc., changes from Catholic to Protestant and creates the Church of England. We have wars over it. And so this was, in that context, Maryland will be a place for Catholics to go. The reality is very few Catholics ever go there, but it's mostly a symbolic refuge. Some do go, but it is a very small population. It's called the Act of Toleration. You have to know this. Basically saying they did have an assembly in Maryland, right? They did have like a House of Burgesses. Same thing as you had in Jamestown. But they made this specific act that said Catholics are allowed to come to Maryland and live in peace. Other colonies, Jamestown, Massachusetts Bay, they mostly disallowed Catholics. New Hampshire and etc. Other colonies will reject Catholics, and that's why this is special. Maryland, basic things with Maryland that you have. It's the proprietary, you got to know that. Lord Baltimore, you got to know that. Tobacco, just like in Jamestown. They had large plantations. Now, this is the agriculture plantation, okay? Agriculture. You're going to have large plantations. You're going to have indentured servants. You're going to have the headright system, but it's also going to have this refuge for Catholics. I hope that you can get that. And eventually they're going to have a lot more slave labor. So Maryland and Virginia, both of these are in a location called the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake Bay will be very similar in development. Eventually, both Jamestown and Maryland will become royal colonies. This is another one. So we have three types of colony. We have a joint stock colony. You have a proprietary colony. And then you have a royal colony. So let's be clear on these. Colony, sorry. So some of them start this way, some of them start this way. They all become royal colonies at by 1700s. A royal colony is just a colony run by the king. What it means is they will have a royal governor, instead of a proprietary governor, a proprietor, or a manager. They will have a royal governor who will be appointed by the crown. And then they will also have a assembly, which basically is a legislature who runs the colony, who makes the laws. And that will be voted on, for example, like the House of Burgesses. Okay, and so the royal colony is appointed, the royal governor is appointed, that's number one. And number two, they'll have some kind of a democratic assembly. Okay, so they will have citizens voting for members to go to the legislature, the House of Burgesses, or the assembly. Then these guys make the laws, and these guys enforce the law. I hope you're getting all this. All right, moving on. We're going to finish up. We're not getting to the other parts today. So again, control by the crown, royal governor. And so what you'll see is Jamestown, they lose their charter because they were never profitable. Once they become a royal colony, then Virginia becomes profitable. Fun fact, look at this. 1607 to 1625, 8,000 settlers went to Virginia. Only 1,200 survived. So that's about 10%, yeah? A little over 10%, maybe it's 20%, 15%. 15% of these people survived. So Jamestown was not a fun place. The Chesapeake is not a great place to go if you're looking for a colony, at least in the early years. Later on, 1650, it's much more stable, much more healthy to live there. All right, we are going to stop there, and we're going to move on with New England on the next program. All right, thanks again. I hope you got most of this. All right, we'll take care.